Dear guests, welcome to Session 1, Climate Change and Conflict. The introduction will be held by the President of the Norwegian Red Cross, former Inspector General of the Norwegian Army, and head of several UN missions, Robert Mood.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. We live in a world that, for the moment, seems dominated by bad news when it comes to climate. Ice melting in Greenland, record-setting fires from the Arctic to the Amazon, summer heat waves, and all kinds of weather-related records falling, drought and flooding. There's a growing number of reports concerning how man has changed nature as well as climate itself. And man is the ever-present factor when we discuss the causes of climate change and who suffers the consequences. National Red Cross and Red Crescent Society volunteers are in every community, reaching around 160 million people annually through long-term services and development programs, as well as 110 million people through disaster response and early recovery programs. Our volunteers have long since seen and experienced the grim reality of climate change. When we say that climate change will bring more extreme weather, droughts that last longer, crops that are ruined, rain seasons that occur unexpectedly or not at all, our volunteers know that devastating impact on people is the common denominator. On young families, on elders, on children, on women, and men of all ages. In June, the Norwegian Red Cross launched a report on the humanitarian consequences of climate change experiences in our international work in a 10-year perspective. The evidence is as overwhelming as it is daunting. Climate change has severe negative impacts on crops, water quality and livelihoods, and it can and it does aggravate existing larger-scale conflicts. When discussing the impacts of climate-related disasters on international peace and security, we must acknowledge to what extent climate change can multiply people's vulnerability in situations of armed conflict. Overall, Africa and Asia are expected to be the most vulnerable regions in terms of humanitarian consequences of climate change. More than 40% of the countries experiencing a food crisis in 2017 faced the double burden of climatic shocks and conflict. In a short-term perspective, we have not found evidence that climate change causes large-scale armed conflicts directly, but it is confirmed that it aggravates and it prolongs existing conflicts. This year, the conflict in Syria entered its 9th year, but protracted conflicts are not a new phenomenon. The international community of the Red Cross, ICRC, has worked to protect and assist those affected by armed conflicts in Afghanistan for more than 30 years, South Sudan for more than 40 years, contexts which are not unique in the way that access to the affected populations is challenging, and security concerns make it difficult for development actors to be present and provide needed services. What is new? What is new is that climate change make the direct and indirect humanitarian consequences of armed conflict even worse. And furthermore, that climate change will negatively impact the possibilities to end the conflicts. Climate change has forced us to work differently. Today, there are approximately 400 extreme weather events every year, which is 4 times as many as during the 1970s. 4 times as many as during the 1970s. In addition to the emergency aid we offer in areas of war and conflict, the Red Cross were responsible for 111 emergency aid operations worldwide in 2017, reaching a record of 8 million people. More than half of these emergency aid operations were established as a result of extreme weather events. In such cases, we deliver food and water, we ensure primary health services, we search for people who are buried under dirt, rubble, and collapsed buildings. We help reconnect families who have lost track of each other, and we take care of people who suffer mentally after trauma and crisis. So the double impact of climate shocks and armed conflict harm people's ability to cope. It exacerbates vulnerabilities and inequalities, especially in situations of armed conflicts where countries, communities, and populations are least prepared to protect themselves and to adapt. Drought in Australia is not the same as in Sahel. In Sahel, armed conflict, deepening poverty, weakening public services, and disruption of traditional means of survival are not only due to conflict, but also because of diminishing usable land and unpredictable water supply. Communities facing dual challenges are disproportionately affected. They often face growing risks of flood or drought and are forced to look for new livelihoods, to move on, change their lifestyle, or simply move away from their homes to the unknown. We also know that in armed conflict, nature habitats as well as civilian infrastructure is often harmed or destroyed, which may in turn have environmental consequences contributing to climate change. When preparing for this introductory remarks, I explored new words to express what is in front of our eyes, to find new ways to talk about an issue that seems almost frighteningly familiar. I wanted surprising approaches to communicate what we already know. I felt I did not have the words to describe the multitude of the dramatic events we are witnessing. Then I realized there is nothing wrong with the words we are already using. They describe perfectly well what is going on. They are words like destruction, famine, distress, damage. The question is, though, if we allow ourselves to fully take in the meaning of these words. Do we realize what it means that climate change will harm most those who are already subject to poverty, conflict, and violence? If we fail, the consequences will be greater humanitarian suffering and larger humanitarian needs than we can ever cope with, no matter the response. So, the world is dominated by bad news on climate, but also about a rising awareness and commitment to make the necessary changes to preserve a healthy environment for future generations. The necessary shift in mentality, our basic approach to nature and climate, is changing. It is not too late. This is the beginning. In the Red Cross, through the efforts of our volunteers, we see what difference people can make to others. That source of strength is going to be fundamental when facing the challenges ahead of mankind. I have heard some say that humanitarians don't do climate. Well, my friends, I've got news for you. We do climate every day. We do the consequences of climate change every day. This is a cause bigger than all of us, but still not too big if we travel this journey together, as we should. And you know, the youngsters are right. It is not that difficult. It's all about will. Thank you.